This is your princess seam sample. In your packet you will find pattern pieces for your bodice side front. Your bodice front is actually in 2 pieces. You'll cut them out. There will be a dotted line that says overlap it to here, and you will overlap the pattern piece and it will make so your bodice front winds up to be a piece that large. So you will cut 1 bodice front, 1 bodice side front. And then the very first step in doing a princess seam is to stay stitch your inside curve. And a princess seam is sewing an inside curve to an outside curve, or opposing curves to each other. The outside curve is fairly prominent here. You can see that the fabric is definitely curved here. The inside curve is a little bit less prominent. It's a pretty mild curve. If it helps you to remember to think what an inside curve is, if you were looking at that and you were a little teeny tiny person, you could stand inside this little hole that was dug with this inside curve here. And so at the style edge, you could actually get in it. It's an inside curve. And so you stay stitch the inside curve. Stay stitching is 1/8 of an inch inside the seam allowance. So with a 5/8 inch seam, my stay stitching is there to 1/2 inch. And the next thing that has to happen is the inside curve between those notches needs to be clipped. And I'm going to show you why. From the bottom of this pattern up to my notch, you'll notice that those 2 pieces of fabric align perfectly. It's no big deal. They will sew together. They will match just like everything else you've ever sewn in your life. From the notch to the top edge, you will see that I can line that edge up and it matches up perfectly, 5/8 of an inch down to my notch. That sews perfectly. Between my notches, where the inside curve is being sewn to the outside curve, you can see that we have a bit of a disparity or discrepancy in how this is going to work. By clipping the inside curve, it's going to allow this curve to become somewhat snake-like and change direction, and this inside curve is going to be changed and align with the outside curve. And so that is why that has to be clipped first. So with that clipping in place, I'm now ready to pin. And when I sew it, I want to be looking at my inside curve. And so I'm going to pin that with the inside curve on top so that my pins are on top there. And I do the parts of this princess seam line first, pin the parts first, that align and match up and that aren't going to cause me any trouble. So the area above my notch and the area below my notch. And as you pin this, be certain that that 5/8 inch seam allowance lines up, those 2 cut edges line up. Okay? Now I'm going to deal with this section of the princess seam that did not line up, and you can see that the fabric kind of tries to solve its own problem, and basically it's going to do what it's almost kind of naturally doing on its own here. Those clips open up, which allow the seam to change direction. The only place on this seam line that is the same length is right at 5/8 of an inch. And so I will take my thumb and finger and feel at 5/8 of an inch, which is just that 1/8 of an inch past where my stay stitching was, and make sure that I have no tucks or no puckers. And then as I'm pinning, it just opens up the clips that were made, which is allowing that seam allowance to turn the opposite direction and become flat. Now before I sew it, I'm going to just simply run, I'm just holding my hand like this, and I'm running between my thumb and my finger, making sure that at 5/8 of an inch, it is completely smooth. Okay? Yes, your bodice front is going to lay out quite bubbled. Your bodice side front should lay somewhat flat. That's why I pinned it laying on the bottom. The piece that's most likely to give me trouble is the piece that's not laying flat. So that's the one I want to be looking at. And we're now ready to sew the princess seam line. So I'm lining up my seam line at 5/8 of an inch. Drop my presser foot, put the needle down into the machine, take a couple of stitches and back stitch. I'm just going to sew this seam at 5/8 of an inch. Again, from the top down to that first notch, it should sew pretty simply without any problem. when you hit the notch and you start approaching that area where the inside seam is being stitched to the outside seam, you'll notice I've now approached the area where my fabric doesn't lay flat, but it will lay flat in short sections, and so I'm going to sew in a very short section from pin to pin. If your machine is in needle down position, so every time you stop the needle's in your fabric, you are less likely to get a jagged or a edge or a bad spot on your stitching. And so I just sew down towards the next pin again, stops in needle down position, pull that pin out. I can now work and manipulate this fabric just a little bit so that it's going to lay flat where I'm sewing. Keep that cut edge lined up, and you can see that I'm able to keep it flat. If you need to lift your presser foot up, lift it up to get some of that fabric out of the way. Continue this around at 5/8 of an inch. Just getting that extra fabric pushed out of the way. Sometimes it will help if you just kind of pull it from the side back and forth a little bit, and it will help to get out of the way. As soon as you get back down to your second notch, the two pieces of fabric align with each other again. And you just need to sew the bottom and backstitch at the bottom. Then you will pull this out, look right side out, and you want to make sure that you don't have any tucks or any gathers any place. And as long as it lays smooth, we're now ready to come and do some pressing. All right, princess seam is sewn. It should align at the bottom, and it should align up here at the arm side. And then you'll notice when you pick it up, the inside curve, those clips are going to tend to open up in order for that to lay flat. And you've got extra fabric here on that outside curve. So we're going to take this, put it over a ham now, and press it. And you find a place on the ham that curves the same way, in the same amount that your princess seam is curving. So I found a spot on the ham, and then you're going to press this princess seam, pressing the inside curve, or the one that you've clipped, open, and letting this iron barely come across so that it helps that seam to lay open, but you haven't pressed that seam flat because you can see that there is some extra fabric there that doesn't want to lay flat. And when you've got that pressed, so your inside seam is laying flat and pressed flat, then we are ready to now clip that outside seam. And so when you clip this, if you will again just kind of keep this on the ham and clip at a tiny little bit of an angle in between or in the midpoint of the clips on the other side. And so what these are going to turn into is notches, but I am starting with just one side of the notch. At a slightly angled clip coming into the center of each one of those clips before. Now you will come back with the iron and you can actually press that seam completely flat. And in the process of pressing that seam flat, you can see that what has happened now over this ham in order to get that flat is those clips now have overlapped each other. And if you will just come back with your scissors and look at where that little teeny tiny overlap is, and basically just reach in there, line up your scissors with where that overlap is, and you clip at that angle. You can see that where I've clipped that, if I open it up, it is a wedge or it is a notch, but as this seam now presses and is pressed open, that wedge actually just becomes closed, and it closes that seam right up for us. And that's our goal, is to have that lay as smooth and those seams be as closed as they possibly can. Your notches will not all be the exact same size, because part of this curve, if you remember back from your pattern, part of this curve was more pronounced as it got closer to the fullest part of the bust. And so you will have, the notches will be a little bit wider or a little bit larger in that spot. And then just give that one more quick press over the part of the ham that fits that the best. And again, now if you look at that, you can see that those notches are aligned so that they just close up and that seam looks closed. And if you pull that to the other side, you will have a very smooth laying princess seam line that lays smooth and even and is attractive as the person wears it. Okay.